It started on what was supposed to be a completely ordinary morning inside the grand walls of the palace. But beneath the sparkling chandeliers and polished wooden floors, an uneasy atmosphere had already begun to take hold. Catherine walked quietly down the pristine corridors, her graceful steps echoing softly against the marble. But she could immediately sense that something was wrong. The palace attendants, usually so calm, precise, and meticulously composed, were moving with a strange, nervous energy. Their bows were polite, and their smiles were strictly on cue. Yet their eyes darted around anxiously as if each servant was carrying a secret far too explosive to hold inside. Catherine paused and asked a young maid if everything was prepared properly for the afternoon briefing, to which the girl nodded nervously and assured her that all was in order before quickly hurrying away. But Catherine knew better than to ignore her instincts. Throughout the morning, whispers floated through the hallways like cold drafts. Every time Catherine drew near, groups of staff members would abruptly cut their conversations short, leaving an awkward, heavy silence in the air. Laughter died down instantly, replaced by guilty glances and hushed murmurs. She tried to tell herself that it was just typical palace gossip, the kind of endless chatter that naturally thrives in such a massive and pressurized household. But deep down, she felt a sharp, persistent foreboding. The air was thick with tension, almost as if the palace itself was holding its breath in anticipation of a terrifying storm. Catherine adjusted her dress, took a deep breath, and resolved to maintain her characteristic poise. Years under constant public scrutiny had taught her how to stand tall and serene no matter how turbulent the surroundings might be. She smiled warmly at the household staff, double-checked the event arrangements, and walked into the briefing room with effortless dignity. The long oak table was polished to a mirror shine, with official documents stacked neatly before every chair. Catherine took her seat near the head of the table, sitting straight and calm, ready to focus on routine royal duties. The meeting began normally, with staff members speaking in soft, respectful tones about scheduling, protocol, and public appearances. Yet the underlying tension remained, humming through the room like an electric wire waiting to snap. And then, the heavy doors opened, and Camilla stepped inside. The atmosphere instantly turned ice cold. Camilla walked into the chamber with swift, aggressive steps, her face set in a hard, uncompromising grimace that instantly stunned everyone present. She did not bother to greet anyone or offer the usual pleasantries. Instead, her eyes locked directly onto Catherine with venomous intensity. The room plunged into a suffocating silence where nobody dared to breathe. Without warning, Camilla unleashed a torrent of sharp, bitter accusations directly at Catherine. Her words sliced through the quiet room like broken glass as she aggressively questioned Catherine's influence, her public standing, and her role within the royal household. Catherine remained calm, keeping her voice steady and controlled as she gently reminded Camilla that they were there to serve the crown and fulfill their duty, not to engage in personal rivalries. But Catherine's composure only seemed to infuriate Camilla even further. Camilla's voice rose to a shrill pitch, fueled by years of deeply rooted resentment that could no longer be kept behind polite royal smiles. The staff sat completely paralyzed in their chairs, terrified to move or make eye contact, realizing they were witnessing a catastrophic collapse of royal decorum. Then, in a moment that shattered every rule of palace protocol, Camilla's explosive anger boiled over into direct action. A sharp, collective gasp echoed off the stone walls as Catherine stepped back in utter disbelief. This was no longer a quiet disagreement hidden behind locked doors. It was a raw, devastating confrontation in front of lower-level staff members who were sworn to confidentiality but were now utterly traumatized by what they had just seen. Catherine did not shout back, nor did she lower herself to retaliate. She simply stood her ground, her face pale but her eyes steady, using her quiet dignity as an unyielding shield. Camilla, trembling with uncontrollable rage, finally turned her head away, unable to bear the heavy weight of Catherine's calm gaze. But just as the room seemed trapped in a state of sheer shock, the doors swung open once more, and King Charles stepped into the room. When King Charles stepped into the room, the overwhelming silence instantly shifted into a terrifying, suffocating air of royalty. His sharp eyes scanned the chamber, taking in the pale, frozen faces of the staff, Catherine's dignified stillness, and Camilla's rigid, trembling posture. It took only a fraction of a second for him to realize that a catastrophic line had been crossed. The controlled, steady image of a sovereign that Charles had spent decades cultivating completely shattered in an instant. The calm demeanor slipped away, exposing a man consumed by absolute fury and deep betrayal. His voice boomed across the hall, cutting through the silence like thunder as he demanded an immediate explanation. He did not even wait for anyone to speak, because the chaotic energy in the room told him everything he needed to know. Unforgivable damage had been done, and the dignity of the crown had been publicly trampled on in front of lower-level palace workers. Camilla attempted to step forward to justify her outburst, her voice dripping with sharp, defensive justifications. But her words only added gasoline to the raging fire within the king. Charles unleashed his anger directly at Camilla, his words raw, unfiltered, and completely stripped of traditional royal diplomacy. He shouted at her for throwing away centuries of decorum, accusing her of allowing personal jealousy to destroy the integrity of the royal household. But his fury did not stop there. In a moment of sheer desperation and overwhelm, Charles turned toward Catherine as well, his eyes burning with intense frustration as he demanded to know why she had let the situation escalate, asking why she hadn't managed to prevent such a public spectacle. It was an unfair accusation, and deep down Charles knew it, but his mind was spinning out of control as he tried to lash out at anything within reach to vent the crushing weight on his chest. The staff members sat frozen like statues, their heads bowed low and their hearts pounding in sheer terror. They had been trained to serve the monarchy with absolute discretion, to take palace secrets to their graves. But what they were witnessing right now was an unmasking of the royal family in its purest, most volatile form. King Charles, normally so meticulous about maintaining composure, completely lost his grip on reality. He paced back and forth, gesturing wildly, accusing the entire room of weakness, incompetence, and failing to hold together the fragile harmony of the crown. He even turned his rage inward, his voice cracking as he declared that he had failed as a ruler to maintain peace within his own home. Every thundering word shattered his royal authority piece by piece. For the first time ever, the staff did not see a powerful monarch sitting on a golden throne. They saw a broken man undone by the intolerable pressure of his position. The weight of generations of expectations, the relentless public scrutiny, and the constant battle to preserve image had all erupted at once, causing a destruction far worse than Camilla's initial attack. Throughout his terrifying rant, Catherine remained completely still and silent. She offered no defense, no argument, and no tears. Her quiet resilience stood in stark contrast to the chaos around her, a composure that Charles simultaneously envied and deeply resented. Meanwhile, Camilla stood her ground with bitter defiance, refusing to bow her head or show remorse. Trapped between these two women, Charles felt the spiritual weight of his crown slip away entirely. By the time his voice finally softened into an exhausted whisper, the irreparable damage was already done. The king had lost control of his own temper in front of dozens of witnesses, and the palace walls had absorbed every single second of his dramatic breakdown. When the meeting was officially dismissed, the staff filed out of the room in total, unnerved silence. Their footsteps hurried down the polished corridors, desperate to put distance between themselves and the chamber of horror. But the moment they reached the safety of distant hallways, the quiet shattered into an unstoppable wave of whispers. Fear had kept their lips sealed inside the room, but the open corridors unleashed a torrent of gossip that spread like wildfire through dry timber. Servants gathered in tight groups, whispering behind closed doors and in shadowed corners. Some passionately defended Catherine, praising her unbelievable restraint and unwavering dignity. They argued that her ability to stand tall without shouting back proved she possessed the true strength of a future queen, representing wisdom, poise, and leadership. Others secretly sympathized with Camilla, whispering that her explosive anger was the result of years of being sidelined and questioned, a desperate cry from a woman fighting to survive in a cold environment. But the vast majority of the palace gossip was centered squarely on King Charles. The servants questioned how a reigning monarch could lose his mind so completely in front of his staff, openly wondering if the heavy burden of the crown had finally cracked his sanity beyond repair. By nightfall, the tense silence inside the palace had turned into a suffocating weight that pressed heavily on every corner of the estate. The private briefing was over, but its explosive aftermath hung in the air like dark storm clouds refusing to clear. King Charles sat completely alone in his dimly lit study, his elbows resting on the polished wooden desk and his head buried in his hands. For the first time in his reign, he felt completely stripped of the majestic armor of kingship. What remained in that room was not a sovereign of absolute authority, but a deeply exhausted, regretful man struggling to process the devastating impact of his own loss of control. When his top senior advisors entered the room, they did not arrive with loud arguments or angry outbursts. Their power was far more calculated and heavy, delivered through low, steady voices and piercing, judgmental gazes. They looked at the king and plainly reminded him of a hard reality. The monarchy was not built on personal emotions, but on the public illusion of absolute stability. Authority existed only as long as the people believed the crown could never break. They warned Charles that the exact second he raised his voice and unleashed his raw fury in front of household servants, he had allowed the ancient myth of royal composure to shatter into pieces. Charles tried to defend himself, insisting that he had been pushed to his absolute limit, that the internal toxic rivalries were unbearable, and that any human being in his shoes would have broken down under such extreme pressure. But the advisors stood firm and unforgiving. They told him bluntly that he was not just any ordinary human being. He was the king. A king could never afford the luxury of public anger, especially not in front of witnesses who would carry those secrets straight out into the world. A single moment of weakness could ruin decades of careful image management. Those heavy words struck Charles harder than any family conflict ever could. He stared into the tall, gold-framed mirror in his room, looking at the tired face reflecting back at him. He saw a man caught in a dangerous trap between Camilla's aggressive defiance and Catherine's icy, dignified silence. Camilla continued to tell her trusted circle that her actions were justified, casting herself as a brave defender fighting against subtle disrespect. Yet behind her brave face lived a deep, terrifying fear of being forgotten, replaced, and eclipsed by Catherine's rising popularity. Catherine, on the other hand, retreated to her private chambers in total silence. She chose not to retaliate, using her quiet dignity as a shield to protect her status, knowing that in the high-stakes game of royal power, composure was the ultimate weapon. But for Charles, Catherine's silence felt like an unbridgeable wall, a constant silent reminder of his own massive failure to maintain order. The rumors could no longer be contained within the heavy stone walls of the palace. What began as nervous whispers among servants quickly seeped through the palace gates, spreading into elite social circles, newsrooms, and public forums across the city. The story gained a life of its own, turning into a massive public debate about the stability of the entire institution. Inside the palace halls, Charles could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. Foreign leaders began asking discreet questions. Media outlets circled like hawks, and the public watched with intense curiosity to see if the king could recover his footing or fall deeper into chaos. Walking past the grand portraits of his royal ancestors late into the night, Charles felt an icy chill run down his spine. The storm that started in a simple briefing room had escalated into a full-scale crisis, raising a haunting question that echoed far beyond the palace gates. Can a king who loses control of himself still be trusted to hold the crown?